Thanks. Okay, so this is one of the pre-consensus meetings that we have for AU Core on Fridays. We've been doing something a little bit different for the last two, where we were going through change requests. That's not normally what we do on a Friday. What we usually do on a Friday is pick some topics, those of priority or interest to go through for AU Core and have a conversation about them. And that's what we're going to get back to today. Now that we've got the ballot for comment, the snapshot out, I'll give a little bit of an update. And then we'll go through on the topic, which was where we were as the priority topic was talking about conformance requirements. Some of our conversation was about FHIR conformance requirements. What is all this stuff about must support? What does it mean that we have obligations? What do we actually want to do in AU Core? And what does all of that mean across not just for system behavior, which is what AU Core is really trying to do, but what does it mean for downstream impacts? And also, what would it mean if there was an external conformance testing scheme, which we all expect is coming, with the government's position that mandation is coming in some form, but we don't know the timelines yet or what that will look like. It's very likely that some form of an external conformance scheme will be picking up what is in AU CDI and what is in AU Core for conformance. And so what we do in the AU Core IG has implications for that. And I think that's some of where our conversation has been. So that's kind of the topic for today. And I also wanted to give, as we usually do, what's our next meeting and what are we talking about there? I'll kind of pause here and say that was the agenda for today. Is there anything else that people think that we should add to this meeting? Any other topics? And if you want to speak, just pop your hand up and either I'll spot you, or if I miss that, one of the other people can sing out if I don't see it while I'm presenting. All right. Seems like we're all keen to talk about conformance. Sounds great. So the first bit is the update. So the ballot for comment came out. That came out last Friday, I think it was. Oh, it's been a long week, so I'm pretty sure it was last Friday. And sign up has also been completed. So we got 78 voters. I think that's the number of individuals. And I think that came from around 25 organisations. So we've more than met the quorum. And it's pretty exciting that we're going to be getting a good amount of feedback to come through and give us some direction on that current ballot snapshot and give us the priorities and what are the things we need to look at. We'll add to one of our upcoming agendas pretty soon. What's the ballot resolution process and what do we need to do as a technical design group to go through that feedback? And we do. Every piece of feedback that's linked to a ballot comes through this group. There's no one person going, oh, I don't think we need to address that. It all comes through the technical design group. Now, if you weren't able to sign up and you still want to put in feedback, go for it. The ballot stuff is about voting, but being able to provide specification feedback in JIRA is open at all times. At the bottom of the IG, in fact, I'll go to it now. I should have set that up. So at the bottom of the AU Core IG, in any IG, not just AU Core, you'll see a propose a change thing right here. If you click on that, that will take you through to JIRA. You'll need to be signed on with your HL7 account, but you can create and put in your specification feedback if you think something's missing, if you think it's too restrictive, if you've got an error, if maybe something needs to be clarified and you've got suggested wording, absolutely, please put those in. Because what's happening in the ballot is that people will be linking different pieces of feedback to say, I'm saying this should proceed, maybe with modifications. and they have to link it to feedback there. And they might say, no, I don't think this can be going forwards unless it addresses a specific set of feedback. And again, all of those have to be JIRA issues. And ballotters hopefully don't necessarily have to raise every single one of those themselves. They'll be looking across the set of feedback that is already existing. And if they spot something that they think needs to be addressed that doesn't exist yet, they'll raise a new JIRA issue. Otherwise, they'll link to existing JIRA issues to go, well, this is already captured and this is what I need. Any questions about that? So as just a quick rundown on how balloting works. There's much more detailed information in a recording session if you're a voter on what you have to do to provide your input and how to link feedback. But I just really want to stress that it is always open. If you have a suggestion for AU Core or feedback, raise it at any time. As soon as you spot that, all right, that's cool. So let's talk about conformance. Now, when we raised that this was a priority point, we did talk about the fact that we really wanted some examples. And I agree with that. We want to go through and we want to do some examples. And I'm happy to put my hand up to be an owner of going through and trying to lead the piece to clarify conformance and must support. But I also want to ask if there are any other people on the line who are interested to join me and I think Andrew Aubrey in going through and working to provide those examples and come back to the technical design group based on the feedback we have with any proposed suggestions or future directions for this content. You can contact me by email. You can also go through chat.fhir.org, or you can put your hand up now if you can. Put your hand up and I'll get in contact with you and we can go through the content and bring it back to the technical design group based on the feedback we're getting in these meetings. So just leaving that open. But let's talk about AU Core performance. So I've got a number of prompt slides. This is a conversation. It's a little bit education, but it's also let's have a conversation about what these words mean in a FHIR context, so that we understand what's currently in AU Core and how that might be interpreted in other contexts, and also how something similar to this has been approached in different countries. Places, especially like the US and Canada, are further down the road than us on having to have a core specification and also having an external conformance scheme in place and having downstream IGs using those. So we're looking to them, I think, for some of the implications of the choices we make. But first up, the two things that are in AU Core. There's two ways to implement AU Core. One is profile only, and one is profile plus interaction. This is a really common pattern across core specifications, that this is layered. With profile only is just data, and profile plus interaction is about the API there. So it picks up the requirements from profile and layers on the interaction requirements. I'll give you a bit of an example. So this is ideally kind of what AU Core does at its sort of foundation. AU Core is looking at how do we address some of the foundational parts of common problems. And foundational parts are things that we have around medications and allergies, and how do I find patient records, and how do I retrieve those results. And we've got two kind of things we look at here. One is the data model in AU Core, and the data model is made up of, we've got AU Core profiles, and there are extensions referenced in those. At this point in time, we don't have any AU Core defined extensions. We reference either extensions defined in AU base or in the external FHIR standard. And there's also terminology. All those things together make up the rules that data has to conform to be conformant to AU Core. And there's also a RESTful API, which is how can you get the data? And a RESTful API in FHIR is defined by capability statements, which we have in AU Core. We've got two, one for server and one for client. And it's defined by operations. We don't have any AU Core specific operations defined. And it's also defined by search parameters. We again don't have any brand new defined search parameters in AU Core, though we have profiled a couple of search parameters to make some parts of the search on AU Core clearer, as in support for change, patient.identifier is in there. And so between those two kinds of things, it says, here's the rules for the data, and here's the way you can ask for the data, and here's what you get back. And we've got some examples here. So from AU Core, we would say you can search for a patient, and you can use an IHI, or a Medicare number, or a DBA, and a gender and birth date in order to find a patient. And that would be and what would come back is a patient record. Assuming one matched those search parameters for identifier and gender and birth date, what would come back from that search is it would return a patient record with demographics. And what would be in that data would be what is defined in AU Core as being mandatory or must support elements. So according to AU Core patient, that would have things like identifiers. It would have name, it would have gender, there'd be date of birth, and it might include some of the optional must support things like birthplace, or Indigenous status, or address and telecom, if that system had that information. And another example of this is searching for diagnostic results, and you could do that. I've not updated these, but let's just say we still had a diagnostic report in AU Core. And you could search by lab number and patient, or you could search by patient and type and date. And then what would come back, depending on what you asked for, would be the results that match either the lab number of the patient, I guess, or an empty bundle, or if you looked for patient and type, you could say things like cardiology, you could say pathology, you could say chemistry, is it would return the results for a patient that it could match that have that type in that date range that was provided. And the data that would come back would be based on what's in the AU Core profile with must support and mandatory, which would have test name is mandatory, date is mandatory, status is mandatory, and we did have performer as mandatory in AU Core diagnostic report. But what was optional, so what might be there, is if the system has it, because it has must support, it would have results and it would have order details. And if we kind of lay that over this kind of thing, what we end up with is the rules for the data is profile only support. Doesn't have any behavioral things in there. It's just what shape is the data. The data conforms to the profiles. And the rules for obtaining the data is the profile plus interaction support. I lay that over this, that's where that comes in. How do I search for things? What can I choose? How do I formulate that search? Is an AU Core requester. And what comes back is covered by AU Core responder. And the data itself is covered by profile only. So I ask, is everyone kind of following me so far on how this sort of overlay works in a FHIR and a conformance sense? Because I don't want to go too fast either. This is a pre-consensus meeting. Let's have a chat about things if there's anything you want to talk about.
I think this is nicely clear.
All right, if we're all following this so far, let's get into the next step, in which we might stop at that point, being clear. So the things we've been talking about whenever we talk about must support, which is just a part of conformance. It's one of the labels we use to say conformance applies to these elements. That's all must support does. It's a label on a set of elements that you go, I've got conformance rules on this, and go find the conformance rules elsewhere. And we call those obligations in FHIR. And what we've been talking about, but sometimes we haven't separated when we've talked about it, is system behavior. That's that thing when we've gone, oh, don't worry about it. If your system doesn't have it, you only have to follow the rules on missing data, because that's what AU Core requires. It says you'll populate all the mandatory stuff. Anything with must support, we've got rules that if your system has it, you have to put it in there. But if you don't have that data, we've got some rules around missing data. And so there's expectations on system behavior. But what we've often included in our conversations is the next thing, this question around, it's all very well and good that we say, if your system doesn't have the data, then you don't have to supply it during a system behavior, during a particular transaction. But from an external conformance scheme wants to come in and you are saying, I am an AU Core server. And you'll notice actually that I'm going to talk mostly around AU Core servers. We'll get to clients, but really that's because AU Core just says on a client, you're not going to throw an error if you get something that's AU Core conformant. That's kind of it. That's really the big obligations on when you get data back and it's conformant to AU Core, whether you don't have to use any of those elements. What you have to do is not error out if you get that resource. So we often don't spend a lot of time talking about the client impacts and obligations. It's much more restrictive, I think, on servers, especially on the external conformance scheme. So coming on to the external conformance scheme, the worry we've often been having, and it is legitimate, and we'll talk about that an external conformance scheme, in order to ask you to prove that your system behaves in a certain way, you often have to do more. And there's a lot of cost associated with this. And there's an expectation that everything that's flagged must support will carry that cost and may impose some obligations we really don't want. Maybe it's okay in system behavior, but when it comes to having to actually assert conformance, and then maybe when it comes to a downstream IG, that's where it becomes a problem. And so we need to make sure in AU Core we're keeping to our minimum kind of perspective on that, so that we aren't imposing these costs for things that aren't a minimum, a core kind of value. There's going to be a judgment call from this technical design group as we go through and talk about these. This is what our group has formed in order to do, to go through and make these discussions and make the decisions. So we're going to keep referring to these kind of three views as we go a bit further. Again, anytime someone wants to make a comment or have a question, just put your hand up and we'll go through that. So if you forgive me, I'm going to jump back to a little bit of FHIR theory. We'll go back to a bit of FHIR theory here. The FHIR standard says, okay, so conformance at an element level, and it is mostly just conformance at an element level here that we're talking about. Data elements have three properties. According to the FHIR standard, you've got cardinality. We've all gotten that. That's mandatory or optional. So far, there's been no questions or concerns about that. But if we want to talk through that, absolutely, then put your hand up, or we can raise it for another agenda item if there's looking like we need to delve into cardinality further. Then there's a must support, which is a flag to say we're going to say something about system behavior. And that's what that does. It's a flag on the elements that you care about in order to describe some system behavior requirements. And the last one is this modifier. I'm going to skip right past that. We don't use it in AU core. It's a whole nother conversation. If it ever comes up, we'll go into it. But so far we've avoided it, and I'd like to keep it that way. And so altogether, these things are how we have the flags to put conformance requirements on implementations. And when we do that on an element in a profile, then what we're kind of saying is we've got something to say here. We're placing obligations on an implementer. And we're saying, what are the kind of conditions and what do you have to do with that particular element? And in AU core, we've got requesters, how can I find data? And responders, how do I give you back data? And then, of course, the requester has to be able to cope with the data it got. It carries on its business if it gets AU core shaped data back. And they're the two kinds of things that we're expecting. And so we're putting an element, we're labeling an element that we decide is meaningful from a core perspective for a request and for a respond. And then based on that, we have to make some rules. And that's what we call obligations. And those can be narrative. That's that MELS support and that conformance page in AU core. That's the narrative description of what are those obligations that a system has to do. There's also a fancy new extension from FHIR, which has come out recently, which is fabulous, which we will have to move to eventually, but can also move to pretty quickly, that actually goes through and says on each element, you don't just label it must support, but for each of the kind of systems you care about, so a requester and a responder, you can use that extension to say responders have to do this on this element and requesters have to do this on this element. And I should show you what that looks like as we go on. But either way, after you've labeled an element must support, you've got to say what it means. And that is what forms part of the element level conformance requirements for a system. How are we going so far? Did I lose people?
Danielle, I will say to the group, if you guys have questions on specific use cases or what this means for things, do ask them, because part of this is understanding it not only in the broad context of the implementation guide, but also when we do these discussions on must support for individual elements and stuff like that. So if you have a question of how much support works or what this presentation is covering, please ask.
Sanjeev, your hand's up.
Yeah, Daniel, I have a question about the second point. Labeling an element must support means that implementations that produce or consume resources shall provide support. So just from a vendor's perspective, my understanding is if our product has that element inside the application, must support means our payload must contain that information.
If you are a responder, if you're going to claim conformance to AU core responder, then yes, that is the correct interpretation.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, which is why I'm sort of confused about the second point over there in that slide.
Well, this is from FHIR in general. It says you
Yeah.
have to provide some support in some way. And then in AU core,
if a product does not
said,
have it, if a product does not have it, how would they support it?
They would
support is not
implement-
applicable to them. Sorry.
they would implement the rules on missing data. AU core has said you shall populate every element that is either mandatory or that is flagged with must support, unless you don't have that data.
Yeah.
And then you implement those requirements, this last bottom point down here. Oops, sorry. Then you shall implement the requirements on missing data.
Okay. Yeah.
This also depends on the must support and interactions too, I think, Danielle, of shall be capable and some of the requirements on that. So being able to demonstrate that you can be capable of supporting that, which would additionally, as vendors, have implications for that.
So that's the external conformance scheme part. The system behavior says missing data, no props, which if it's optional, if you don't have the data in your system and it's optional, don't include that element in your FHIR resource, basically. If it is mandatory, you must include that element in your FHIR resource. And then you will declare that this data is missing. And the AU Core IG says exactly how to do that. And we are consistent with how the HL7 international guides do that, and also with how US Core does that, to make sure that we aren't introducing variants when there's no need to be in Australia. I think I've got an example later on, but there is a section in the IG that's got some fairly good examples, I think. We go down to missing data, and it describes what you do. So if it's non-coded, so there's examples here with what that would look like on the wire, for depending on the data type. And if you find any errors with this, or you don't think it works, let me know, or also raise a piece of feedback on the spec so that we can improve that. Okay, minimize that. So where were we? Okay, we were here, which is all kind of abstract FHIR theory at this point, which is basically saying the elements you care about that you want to have rules on, put must support as a label on them. And then you, in your implementation guide, need to say what it means. Which is, I guess, this part for us, where we have said, we have decided, we have data-only rules, we've decided we have ways to ask for data and ways to get data back. But that sort of simple level, and some rules, therefore, around those. And they apply to any element that would have must support. No one should be surprised by this. I think there's way too many must supports in AU Core. I think we need to take a whole bunch out. And hopefully we'll get there soon to be having the question of, is this truly a minimum requirement? Do we impose this obligation on every single system? Or do we leave that to some sort of downstream or use case implementation guide, because it's not across multiple use cases. Okay, but back to this. So I wanted to come back to then profile only, profile plus interaction. Let's start with profile only, because these two things go together. And profile is just the data. So this is lifted directly from the AU Core IG, and I'll put it in common language soon, where it says systems may deploy and support one or more AU Core profiles. And a system that implements profile-only support uses the profile's content model without expectations on the interactions. So it's profile-only, it's not profile plus interaction. And that means you populate all the mandatory stuff. And mandatory is signified by a cardinality that has a 1 as its minimum. And you shall populate it with all the profile elements that label must support, unless you don't have that data. And where it's not there, you have to implement the requirements on missing data. To just show you an example of that requirement. What this means in common terms is for each profile supported, I'll call out here, it's on a profile by profile basis. So there's no such thing as saying, I am profile only and just saying AU Core. You have to call out each profile so you can choose which ones. You would say, I am AU Core patient profile only. Maybe that's your only resource. Maybe you have other FHIR resources, and for every resource you have that has an AU Core profile, you're conformant, but maybe you're not. Maybe it's more meaningful for you to have just some. That's what AU Core requires. I can't, there's also, I suppose, if we think that's the system behavior, that's the requirement that AU Core says, you say which profiles your data conforms to, and you choose. I suppose when we think about what would an external performance scheme require, that external performance scheme, if it says for this particular case, we expect you to be AU Core conformant, and we expect you to be conformant to the following profiles, that may layer on an obligation where you don't get to just choose yourself which ones those are. And for a downstream impact, if we talk about a downstream IG, there is an expectation that when a use case IG in Australia, we can talk e-requesting because that's work that's going on now, is profiling a resource that is also in AU Core, it is expected to be conformant to the AU Core profile. And if it is not, I would expect that we would need to, and the FHIR working group is looking at having a variance process so that there's a way for a project to say, this actually doesn't apply. I've got legitimate reasons as to why my use case, this isn't actually appropriate. And for that to be looked at our overall governing body, which is the FHIR work group, and say, yes, that's completely reasonable. Andrew, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, I just want to clarify. Sanjeet had a good question in the chat about, does profile only mean only read, search, webhook capabilities and profile, or does it in interactions is delete, update, create? And the answer is no. Profile only is dictating how you are using the resources, what data elements are on there. It says nothing about the actual interactions or how you're using it. It is only the form of the data. And then like, what are the use cases for doing profile only? As Danielle just mentioned, kind of downstream use cases of other implementation guides inheriting these profiles, or if you're doing a server only thing for data storage or something like that, there's a couple different areas where profile only would be preferable to also having to implement the interactions.
Yeah, or even usage as an input into decision support or something like that, where you can say, I'm expecting AU Core to be able to do a decision support action, right? So it's, yeah, out of context of the API.
Another case would be if you want to have a different exchange mechanism than RESTful. If you want to send messages or documents or something, then you could say, I'm sending documents and the document structures are as expected by AU Core, but I'm not doing any of the AU Core processes.
Yeah, or even another case is even if you're creating, this is still FHIR API related, creating operations that are custom operations or specific operations that you need to define the data format, but it's not doing regular CRUD kind of activity.
Bulk extract is probably the scenario that we're going to be dealing with sooner than later.
Yep.
Or next.
Dump it in a file.
Yeah. Or through an API process, but that it's different to the rest.
So yeah, I think there's plenty of use cases for doing profile only, but again, that's the format of the data. The interactions come in to say, now you're using those profiles with the specific interactions such as read, search, update.
Agreed. Any other comments or questions on that topic? Ruben?
Hi, Danielle. Hi, everyone. Sorry, I'm a bit late. I was talking to Graham. I'm not sure exactly what we're talking about, but it sounds like it's related to must support. This is a broad question for everyone. The more I think about must support and all of this stuff, the more I find myself wondering if we shouldn't just go to obligations straight away rather than using must support. It just feels to me like we can get the level of detail we actually want at the outset and potentially do away with a lot of debate about what we think we might mean. So that's the question. Can we put it in R1?
I think you're a bit advanced for where we are in the discussion, Ruben. I don't think we've quite got to that part yet about
Yeah, look, happy to wait then. That's fine.
Yeah, but it will come up, the question about what are the structural tools we use to be clear about what the obligations, lowercase o, are, the things we expect system behavior to do on an element that has the must support flag on it.
Yeah, I think like must support as a tool just to define expectation and scope is really useful, because it's it kind of says these are the elements we have some position on, and therefore you can expect these elements to be used, and you can expect that perhaps these elements have missing data supplied, and so your system should behave that you know these things will be coming to you, and if they are populated, you know how they work, right? So I think that's a useful scoping tool. It also indicates the elements that aren't must support as yet fall into the under this scope of interest. We don't have a position on any of those things yet, right? So I kind of, it is a bit fuzzy, but I think it is actually super helpful for someone building an application or something like that to understand what they can expect to receive, and just as and this is less about conformance and more about just expectation on how systems behave. Yeah.
Okay, so if you say, I'm implementing profile only support, just bring it back. You need to say which profile it is for your resource type, and that means it conforms to the profile, and it means it conforms to the AU core missing data requirements. An example of that, oh, thank God I have one. I wasn't sure I'd done that. So if we just take a snippet of patient and we wanted to say, the missing data requirement here, patient, this is conformant. I don't know the identifier. Identifier is mandatory in patient, so you will have to say something about it. And in this case, your system doesn't have identifiers for the patient. You would have to do this. This is the requirement for AU core. You use the data absent reason extension to say unknown. That's conformant. What this would look like if it wasn't conformant, and there's so many ways to be not conformant, but kind of only one way to be conformant in this space, is here's an example where there's a local extension for saying, I don't know this. That would not be conformant to AU core, because you aren't implementing AU core's requirements on missing data. And yes, I've just sort of made that up here on what that might look like. But one of the things that you get around must support, labeling that element, is that we say we have a consistent agreement on what you're going to get for this element. If identifier wasn't labeled must support, or on the other things that aren't labeled must support, you might get these other extensions. You don't know what they are because AU core doesn't have a system behavior requirement or any other kind of requirement on how to handle that being missing. Is that sort of, was that example helpful? Maybe, maybe not. Okay, so.
One thing on that particular example is the pages are so similar. You've got to stay alert to notice what the difference is.
Yes, the difference is a different extension. Yeah, it's true. I should have some boxes and colors on it to draw people's attention next time. Just mocking this up about 5 minutes before this meeting. Barty, your hand is raised.
Yes, hi. So if in a single profile there are multiple must support elements, and if more than one is missing, is it right to say that we'll need a reason, data absent reason for each?
You have to implement the missing data requirements on all of them. the particular example I gave, so only for non-coded elements, if it's not codable data type or coding data type, you have to use the extension. If it is a coded data element, and you can say unknown, just using that actual like same structure, you don't need to put the extension in. And you would have to apply the rules for missing data on every element that has must support on it. If you don't have that data, if you do have it, you have to supply it.
Okay. Thank you.
And that's on mandatory elements.
It's on, yes, it is.
Yeah.
If an element is optional, so this is only if it's mandatory.
Yeah.
If it is optional, the data element shall be omitted from the resource. So you don't send it, basically. Don't say that you don't have it, just don't include it. Because in FHIR standards position, not including the element is exactly the same as saying my system doesn't have this data. Sanjeev, your hands up.
Yeah, just to add on to what you just explained, Daniel. So in case it's a mandatory element, change would regardless be needed on a vendor's side to include a data absent extension, even if you don't have the data element available in the product.
Absolutely. At the API end, you don't have to do it internally, but that is the expectation that when this is exposed, the data that you are sharing, we have the same way of knowing that you don't have this data, because you're declaring you conform to the profile. And if the profile has a mandatory element, you have to populate it, or you aren't conformant to the profile. That's
And
yeah.
Two-part question. Just from a vendor's perspective, in some instances the data might have been not have been captured historically. Product might be supporting now, but historically the data might not have been captured. In that case, we'll be sending both unknown data absent and the extension. It's possible that the vendor can send both.
Yep.
It is. I ran into this when I was working at the Digital Health Agency, and we were converting data from STU3 to R4. And R4 has a whole bunch of mandatory elements that weren't mandatory in STU3, and we had to populate all of those with this extension.
And there's other reasons data might be absent as well, other than just your system doesn't support it. Yeah. So yeah, you may have capability of recording some of those as well, depending on your system. So you may
That's
be
true.
able
This
to,
is for missing. If you have a known reason on why you don't have something, I think that's a different use case, and you're able to actually store that. But if it's mandatory in order to be conformant, that you won't be able to validate against the profile if you don't have that element instance in the resource. And we should also fix this example, because that's not a resource in AU Core. We should change that to being, something.
patient.
Patient or something else. Yeah.
Patients don't have outcomes.
No. Well, anyway.
We'll work it out.
Neil, your hand's raised?
Yes, on the flip side, you said if the must support is optional, then we can omit it. But will the external conformance tester still expect it? Or that's
yes. That's a good question. That's us going now into considering AU Core system behavior is one thing. We've just talked about system behavior, right? But would an external conformance scheme say, it's nice, but I'm going to make you prove that you're capable of doing that? That's the question. It's not something we're controlling in the AU Core ID. We're controlling system behavior. And to some extent, we also control the downstream impacts in the HL7 AU FHIR space. What we don't control is the formal conformance testing, but we need to keep it in mind. So should we talk about that, about what that would look like? Would there ever be a conformance scheme that is just on profiles profile only data. And could it legitimately ask a system to do system behavior that isn't just the data? I suspect that's probably not. I think we're going to run into it on profile and interaction, which would have things like creates and updates and those kinds of things associated with it. Which, oops, our slides are further on. But it's possible. Does anyone else want to comment or speculate on what that might be and what we might need to think about?
Yeah, I think from a previous experience or experience in other locales, when that formal conformance testing portion comes in, there is a section on must support about shall be able to populate or has the capability to populate, that when we get into the interactions portion becomes a lot more relevant. And Neil, to your point of, if the external conformance comes in and says, according to must support, you need to demonstrate the capability to populate this, when they do a query on an element, just showing missing data, data absent, or excluding it according to the rules of must support may not be sufficient enough. That according to the must support definition, that external conformance can say, you need to show us the capability to populate that. And we have seen in doing conformance certifications in other locales that those external conformance things will come in and say, you do need to show this element is capable of being populated, which may lead to additional development or time spent adding things to your systems or adding things to your FHIR databases, whether you are FHIR native or a facade, to be able to demonstrate that capability, even if it provides no value in the workflows that your system does. So that is something to be very cognizant about, that external conformance, if it follows must support to the letter, does have a capability aspect to be able to demonstrate that.
I guess my only concern with that is like most software vendors, like in terms of clean code and all that, they don't want to have code there which isn't any use. In fact, we actively clean that up. So for it to be conformant, we would have to, as Brett put it the other week, fudge it just for the conformant, but that's not the true reflection of the software.
No, and that is a very important consideration. And I know from personal experience, we had to add a care plan and goal or some similar field that really doesn't get used, just to be able to show conformance. And then it just doesn't end up being used at all widely or across our customer base.
Brett?
Yeah, I think we're gonna have to talk about this a lot more, but you know, because if there's no necessity for conformance to actually check that you can do all these things, you could happily populate a patient with missing data and empty data, right? And that you'll be conformant. So it's you know, so there has to be some kind of requirement in terms of being able to achieve something. So I think that, and I think that's also just in our scope of this exercise as well, that's the something, if we're going to have this have some teeth in the sense that this actually describes something a system does, you know, we need to be able to not make that too onerous or too incompatible with a large chunk of systems. Because if we find there's a cohort that do something and a cohort that don't, effectively it's kind of saying we need more than one profile, right? And I'd like to think in AU core we can have something that's very generally acceptable, right? And then try and aim for that. That's about all. Yeah.
And I think that comes back to Danielle's earlier point of, there is a lot of must supports in AU core currently. And if we're going to be having a capability portion on it, we need to be very judicious about each must support and if we keep it, and what value it adds to the conformance spec for the entire technical design group and larger healthcare industry that we're interoperating in.
And Ruben, your hand is up next.
Thanks, Danielle. Look, I think I'm agreeing with what Brett was saying, and I think what Andrew was saying as well. I don't understand this need to fudge things. I think it's a bit ridiculous, to be quite honest. And I'm also really not sure where the conformance scheme around this is actually defined. So I know we've got FHIR conformance and we'll state rules and things like that. But, you know, this sort of onerous requirement to demonstrate ability of something you're never going to implement or release as production software perhaps is more appropriate in a technical specification for something concrete and not AU core. So
What?
I guess my parting thought here is if that definition is saying that for AU core conformance, then I would support us reviewing that.
I'll comment on that. What I think we're saying is that AU core doesn't say that. AU core defines system behavior, but that when that system behavior and external conformance schemes, which don't exist yet, but likely will, given where the government is going, similar to the US, will apply external conformance schemes onto AU core. And we're discussing what the lessons we've seen in other jurisdictions around what that means. I think, Brett, you've also put your hand up again.
Yeah, because I think that the whole thing is like, there's a discussion here about whether you support an element or not, but even kind of within the element, you may only support, say, a subset of a value set, even though the value set says something in the AU core spec. So it's essentially a similar problem in that I shouldn't be required to demonstrate I can support the whole value set if my business doesn't cover that, right? So it's I think we're going to have to kind of, I think the conformance needs to be really thought about very deeply in terms of what it's trying to achieve. And it may be that there's different conformances for different purposes, and you know, that's something to consider, because you could do something like a no missing data conformance, which means you can't have missing data, right? That's one kind of conformance you could do, you know, which it has a lot of teeth, but it does give some guarantees to the people. If you can meet that criteria, the receivers of that are going to have a high ability to be able to do certain things, right? So it's I think part of it, I think this is going to need a bit of thought downstream, and I'm not sure we should even decide that in AU core anyway, really, because it's to me there's different levels, and we could probably think of that as a broader question on how profiles get tested, because there's actually different ways to approach it, I think, even though the definition says something. Yeah,
I think that's reasonable. I mean, AU core is and should define system behavior. That's the point with the RESTful API. But I don't think it can or should, which is also going to Ruben's point, go into a conformance scheme. That's not its job. We just, I guess, need to be cognizant of and informed that there is probably an external conformance scheme that will be coming, which will have some requirements in it anyway. But I think we need to be, I guess, aware of that on what we're setting must support elements and the things that they can hang off in the IG.
Yeah, Danielle, because I think I find must support is a great tool to define a framework of activity, so you can make assumptions about what will exist and be used and be available, and that's sort of in the absence of conformance, right? So if I just have an application and I can understand what to expect and how FHIR will be used when I connect to this system, that's actually super useful. And applications can actually behave in a sensible manner. So applications can ask for data, know how to ask for it, know which fields they expect to be populated, if there's missing data, they can handle it appropriately. They might say, I can't do the business I want if this data is missing. So there's all these useful kind of behaviors you can build in that aren't really conformance questions. They're more just expected behavior kind of questions. And I think that's actually very useful in itself. Yeah.
Okay, we'll have last comment then from Ruben, because we're coming up to time on this, and then I'll, I guess, move to final business and close the meeting. Ruben?
Yeah, look, that's good discussion here. I guess I just want to find out, is everyone broadly supportive of the idea that AU cores must support rules? If the interpretation exists that it means a must support element, you have to demonstrate support for it, even if it's optional in implementations. Does everyone agree that that should not be the interpretation and that we should add text clarifying that? Or does anyone disagree?
I might disagree. I'll have to think through it. And the only reason I might disagree is if you go to buy something, maybe that is AU core compliant, but it turns out they don't handle that element at all, is that okay? Because they've not built that in.
I think we've got to be careful
So,
about distinguishing compliance and conformance.
Yeah.
Yep. And I'd come back to my previous remark about obligations then, Daniel. If there's, I mean, that's really where I'd want it to be clarified what the actors in the specification are actually required to do in terms of must support, because it's a bit vague.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think my concerns are actually addressed by if you have the element, you have to send it if it's in your system, and therefore there's an expectation that if it's relevant to your system, you will have the element.
Yeah, the thing is, AU core's a general case, right, as well. So we don't quite have the same roles and responsibilities kind of mentality, I think, on the interactions, because they're so general purpose. So it is really tricky, because I think what you're aiming for is a very nice general purpose use case, which is not defined really. So it's very hard to say what's okay to be missing, and that's because if you have a very specific set use case that requires things, that's actually
I agree
level.
with that, Brett,
Yeah,
and I think that the minimal case will be when you're using obligations is instead of must support, you'll say populate if available, and on the receiver end, you'll say do not crash if you receive it.
Do not crash.
Yes. That is what we say. Yes. All right. So let's wrap this up. I think I just want to check with everyone, because this is how we've kind of been approaching the opening of the must support discussion. Have people found this useful? Maybe put your hands up. Do we want to keep having this kind of open discussion on this topic? All right, that's looking like people are, yep, for us continuing this. Excellent, thank you. That gives me help with our future scheduling stuff. We're going to keep doing this then and talking about what it is and what adjustments we want to make to the text and what it all means in AU calls, so that we get that right, or at least annoy people only a little bit, maybe across the board. Our next meeting is the face-to-face. Nothing's changed on the agenda, so that's the 20th of March there. I'll do one quick share screen. There are all the links I'd sent out previously anyway, where this is going to talk about medication statement and medication request. And can people still see my screen?
Yep.
Yes. Okay. Sorry, I just got a pop-up that said Zoom quit unexpectedly, but okay.
Oh, apparently it did.
Delayed death.
Delayed, yeah.
It was.
All right, all the best, everyone. See you.
Anyway,
See you guys.
if you're around next week, we'll see you in person. But otherwise, oh, you're back.
I'm back.
It
Yeah,
was
Okay.
that's great. I'll see you next week if you're there.
See
Otherwise,
you,
we've got a
Danny.
virtual. Thanks, everyone.
See you next week. Bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye, thank you.
Bye.
That was the funniest